Hello, I'm David Zahn of OK Now What, and I'm going to try something a little different in this session here. I'm going to give you some thoughts on the number one biggest mistake that trainers make and some ideas on how to actually avoid that. This will become a weekly series where every Wednesday I will come into our Facebook group here, Catapult into a Career in Coaching Consulting, and share some thoughts that may be pertinent to you as you think about your own transition into the world of corporate training, instructional design, freelancing, and providing employee development, etc. So check back every week on Wednesday whether you come to the live sessions or the recorded sessions, it will be available to you in the Facebook group. So today's session again is focused on really the thing that stymies so many training opportunities. And that is the number one biggest mistake that a trainer may make, really in the interest of doing good, but they stumble and fumble because they have created an issue for themselves with this biggest mistake. So, when it comes to thinking about the biggest mistake that trainers make, perhaps you're thinking it has something to do with instructional technique, pedagogical and didactic approaches. Maybe it's the use of technology, or maybe the non use of technology. All good ideas and things that we certainly as trainers need to be aware of, need to factor into how we design and develop our training, but not the biggest. Or maybe, as one of my clients once shared with me, you're convinced the biggest mistake is the lack of activities, exercises, opportunities to demonstrate mastery of a topic. And surely any good learning intervention will include some demonstration of expertise of the concept or the behaviors in a training program. We can't do without that. But again, not the biggest. Another client of mine was certain and actually wanted to debate the issue with me about the evaluation being the biggest mistake that people make as trainers, that they don't consider what would be a relevant evaluative approach. They don't think about what kind of testing to include. And this certainly is often an issue where training is provided, but there is no evaluation. It is just more of a check the box. Yes, we completed training, now on to the next. And no one ever goes back to say, well, did we accomplish the objectives? Have people's behavior changed? Are they more capable or competent? Those are all very critical parts of training and parts of any educational endeavor. And we could certainly do ourselves a great favor by thinking through how best to evaluate any one of our training activities. But sorry to say, that's still not the biggest issue, the biggest mistake that a trainer makes. So maybe as we start to narrow down, you're thinking that, well, then what exactly is it? And in fact, the biggest mistake is one that stares us all in the face, and that is not correctly identifying who the customer of the training is. Now, with that as a hint, maybe it's starting to coalesce in your mind, but I'll share with you, even if we know that, some of the mistakes that trainers will make in thinking about how best to answer that. So, for instance, is the customer of training the person being trained, him or herself? Seems like a good answer, but no. Actually, that's not the customer of the training? Is it perhaps the technical expert, the professional who is the provider of subject matter expertise, who knows exactly how a particular task should be completed? Is that person the customer of the training as the expert who knows best? And by the way, the answer to that is no. And while it's not the focus of this particular conversation, it's really dangerous to ask a subject matter expert to provide training because they oftentimes get a little confused about where the need to know crosses into perhaps nice to know. To make it more practical, when you went through driver's ed, chances are you were taught where the brake pedal is, how to put the key into the ignition to start the car, but few of us actually learned about the science of combustible engines. An expert sometimes will try to demonstrate all there is to know about a particular subject or topic and goes far beyond what the person who has to perform a task actually requires in order to complete the job appropriately, correctly, safely, effectively, efficiently, etc. That's really where the focus needs to be. So it's not the subject matter expert, the professional who is truly the customer of the training. They're essential, they're vital to creating the content, maybe creating some of the activities or exercises required to demonstrate how to best perform, but they are not the ultimate customer. So maybe you're thinking, I know, it's the manager of the person or persons being trained, because after all, they've got to ensure that the performance is done correctly, and they have an obligation back to the organization that things are done well. And yeah, those people are part of the process, but they're not the biggest customer yet. So we keep narrowing this down. We're not getting, it seems, an answer to what the biggest mistake is within finding who the true customer is of our training. So maybe you're thinking, oh, it's no one internal at all. It's the actual user of the product or service. It's the ultimate person who is the customer of the business's offering. And I would certainly grant you, we need to keep that in mind as we design, develop, deliver our training. How does it impact the ultimate user of product or service? But still, in the world of training, we have yet to hit upon who exactly is the number one customer of training that we need to be aware of, familiar, and meet his or her needs. So we've given you a lot of good, insightful parts of the process, but they're not the ones who are the true customer at this point. So if you are listening to this and you're currently a teacher or previously formerly were a teacher, you may feel compelled to try to please all of the above because oftentimes, not always, oftentimes teachers are personally people who like to be people pleasers. They want others to uh, gain, they want them to succeed. And so, unfortunately, sometimes when a teacher makes the transition into the corporate world, they find themselves trying to meet everyone's needs. And unfortunately, that sometimes leads to sub optimizing, meeting anyone's needs because they're chasing around everyone's great idea. Everyone has a thought. And okay, yeah, we'll do that. We'll work on a training for this and we'll create a workbook for that. And I'll have a job aid developed for you in 2 months on this particular issue. And that's really not going to suit us well if we have yet to identify who the true customer of our training is. Because you'll get pulled in so many different directions. And if you're not careful, many of those directions can actually be in conflict or contradictory to each other. And let me give you an example. So let's say sales wants training on how to properly discount the product so that they can make more sales if they understood the parameters and boundaries around discounting behaviors. How much volume can I give a certain percentage discount? And how can I leverage a prospect's interest to go down the sales process to make the ultimate sale? Well, at the same time that sales wants to do that, finance wants to cut costs and increase margin. So you have the VP of sales telling you, train us on how to work on proper discounting behaviors. And then you have the chief financial officer saying, we must instill discipline around margin protection. At the same time, we need to see how we can cut some of the excess costs out of the system. Well, those are sometimes going to be in direct competition with each other. What are you, as the trainer, going to do when you have these competing priorities? That's going to get to the core of who exactly is our biggest customer. And maybe another example, marketing wants to improve customer satisfaction, something that marketing certainly would have a focus on in their endeavors and initiatives. At the same time, operations wants to reduce the number of customer service representatives and maybe even transition to an automated bot on the webinar, not even a live person, but some kind of electronic Q&A functionality to reduce or limit the number of bodies actually being hired and rely on these automated response systems. Well, again, you want to improve customer satisfaction from marketing, and operations wants to limit, if not do away, limit the number of people capable of doing that. Again, you have competing initiatives, and you, as the trainer, could very easily perhaps meet either, but very difficult to meet both. It's certainly enough to drive any sane person to pull their hair out. And you can see I've been down that road. The biggest mistake really is not recognizing what the impact of the training project, whatever it may be, has on the organization's business goals and objectives. Everyone the trainer encounters is going to have some great idea, and very often they have their own personal favorite project, but it's often driven by their own self interest, and it maybe impacts their department, their function, their region, but it's not necessarily what is needed or best for the business as a whole in its entirety. Often, there's no back to the organization's goals tie in, and the objectives that the organization has established may not be included in this great idea that a person, an employee has within the company. It meets their departmental, their functional objectives, perhaps, but it doesn't truly move the needle for the business as a whole. And still, other times, training can be thrown around as just a stopgap, an idea that someone has whenever performance is lagging in an area. I know the performance of our department is off by a certain amount. People need to be trained. Well, that may be true, but sometimes it's a non training issue. It could be a selection or a hiring issue. Do you have the right people with the right competencies and skills and background and experience in that particular job role or job function? So you could perhaps offer training, but if they don't come to the job with a certain amount of expertise or experience, it'll be a very long, hard, slow road to get them up to a level of performance. And very often it becomes frustrating for that person in the job, and they'll leave before they ever reach that level of mastery. So sometimes it's not a training issue, it's a selection or a hiring issue. It might be a reward or compensation issue. People know how to do the job correctly and appropriately, but they're actually not rewarded for it. The reward system is more focused on some other aspect of the job. So rather than perform as they're supposed to on this job task, they choose not to, really very consciously, because it's not part of the reward or compensation system to do that particular task or to do it as well as perhaps it could be done. So may not be a training issue at all. You're training those people on how to do what they already know how to do, but they're choosing purposefully not to do it. Not because they're bad or evil people, but because they're not rewarded for doing that, and they are rewarded for doing other tasks. Another possibility is that uh, they may not have the right resources or tools to do the job. You want people to cut wood, but you don't provide them with a saw. More practically, it may be you want people to manage a process, but they don't have the software. They don't have the forms that they could use to best identify where a process is going out of kilter. So they're unable to perform the job because they don't have the tools. Imagine it was a restaurant and you wanted to manage inventory, but there is no way to track how much food has been ordered, how much food has been served, how much food has been wasted. All you can do is eyeball it and say, seems like, feels like, I guess. And that's a very inaccurate way of running a restaurant, to be sure. So as we start to narrow down into, if it's not any of these particular biggest mistakes, all of them, by the way, being mistakes, but not the biggest one, the final answer to the number one mistake is not recognizing who's going to pay for the training, even if it's an internal charge. Whose budget does it hit? Who is ultimately going to be responsible for the success of this training initiative? If that ties back to the stated business organizational goals and objectives, you're going to have now identified the number one way to avoid making a mistake. If your training supports the business goals and you have correctly identified who is what's called the sponsor of the training, translation, the person who actually is responsible for the result, who is actually going to spend their budget to create the training, you are on much firmer ground than, oh, I've got a great idea. Why don't we do it this way? Hey, how about that? I've noticed this other thing. Could you perhaps do training around that? Those are the things that can get a trainer into trouble. So link back to business goals and objectives, link back to who ultimately has to answer for the results. Now, you as the trainer, you have a large stake in it, but the line manager, the executive who ultimately has to answer for, was this a good spend of resources, be it currency, money, hours devoted, purchase of tools, resources, etc. That's ultimately the sponsor. That's ultimately the person that you're going to have to please. So you want to avoid chasing your tail with all of the other good ideas that will be presented to you, and ask the question if you're uncertain: how does this training tie back to the business goals? How is this going to impact what the organization has as their objectives? If there's a clear answer to that, you're on the very right track. So look for the person with the budget responsibility. Look for how it ties back to the stated business goals and objectives. And so your ability to decipher how your training efforts maximize the value to the organization, you will be on very, very strong footing then. In the From Learning to Earning program that I offer, you'll become far more proficient in this and many other aspects of corporate training and instructional design. And you'll be able to do it all within 3 months. The program will get you completely capable and competent in 3 months so that you can transition from your current role and job into a role as a corporate trainer or instructional designer. So we'll explore how to navigate the frankly sometimes choppy and political waters of corporate training and instructional design, and we'll ensure you are able to meet all the various training initiatives properly, and you'll be supported by the right person with the right research and reasons to help you make this transition as smooth as possible. I look forward to joining you in our next Wednesday's call as well. Thank you for participating in this one.